Welcome to a special Bayside Stories. Today, I'm interviewing our own Lynn. You see, she's getting ready to launch her new Kickstarter project, the Shulim Cycle, Book of Susan. So, without any further ado, Lynn, welcome to Bayside Stories.
Thank you, Nick.
Okay, before we get everything started, right now our viewers are being treated to a rotation of images. What are these, and what's the purpose, besides the obvious, giving the eyes something to see while you listen?
These images are either from my blogs and websites or from Pinterest. The images between the book covers are some concept images that help lead to the beautiful cover that Catherine Naudet created for the Shulim Cycle Book of Dahlia. Some of them are my favorite concept images. They're pictures that I added quotes to from the book, or images I just find inspiring.
Well, we seem to have a lot of them, so unfortunately our audience isn't going to see a full attribution at the end of the video. So Lynn, if people want to know where these images came from, where can they go?
They can visit my Pinterest page. They can also visit the Writer's Manifest or the Shulim Cycle blog. All three links are contained in the bio section of the Kickstarter promotional page.
Well, okay. So we're here to introduce people to the Shulim Cycle Book of Susan. Tell us about the book and why people will want to support this project.
In Book of Susan, we return to Eduli Springs, Georgia. We rejoin Devon, who still needs to go through the aftermath of what happened at the end of Book of Dahlia. I don't want to spoil the first book in case anyone listening hasn't read it yet, but I will say that at the end, life does go on after some bad things happen. Sometimes we get too busy to deal with the effects, but they're still there, and in Book of Susan, they catch up to Devon in some serious ways. We're also going to catch up to Dahlia, get to know her rival William a little bit better, and meet her mentor Juliet. I also introduce into my supernatural world my own vision of the familiar Sanguine vampire. I have a third kind as well, but I don't want to spoil that.
So, Sanguine vampire. That's the common blood drinker, right?
It is.
What are some of the ways that you re-envision the classic vampire myth? What concepts do you keep, and what do you expand on?
I've always liked the idea of the vampire being trapped in darkness. That marriage to me is part of what makes a vampire romantic. Not in the love sense, but in the literary sense. Of course, the first Sanguine the reader meets is able to walk around in broad daylight, but that's Darius, and he is unique. The reader finds out about that right away. On one hand, his ability to walk in daylight is part of the greater Shulim cycle, and his story and his whole role is going to become more apparent later. On the other hand, I want him to be an outsider to his own kind. The reader experiences them, the other Sanguine, through his eyes. And while Darius is not our hero, I wanted to create a twisted sense of sympathy and familiarity between him and the reader. So, my Sanguine typically can't walk in daylight. Piousness hurts them as well. Their reaction to holy images and holy ground can vary from aversion to death, depending on the circumstance.
Okay, so no walking on holy ground.
Mostly. I don't want to get into it too much because I will play with it later on. Holiness is a complicated thing, and sometimes it matters how you dedicate something or what it's dedicated for. But some of the classics do remain, like holy water. I also did something else with them. My Sanguine vampires can manipulate you, but not through your mind. They manipulate you through the physical expressions of your emotions and desires, pheromones. It can seem like psychic control, it can even mimic it, but it's not the same thing. They do this not just by being able to smell or taste the chemicals, but by being able to sense them on their skin. For Darius, when he's doing his manipulations, he envisions it like pulling at strings. And it's more than just control. Sanguine are very sensitive to touch. A Sanguine can stand in a room, close her eyes, and tell you how many people are there, give you a basic shape of the bodies, even some distinguishing facial features, and tell you who's moved where in the room. She can do this because she can sense on her skin the slightest change in air around her. Of course, there is a downside to that kind of sensitivity. My Sanguine cannot stand to be touched. Even clothing has to be chosen with care. Sanguine have always tended, if they choose to wear clothes, to have the finest fabrics, not for vanity, but because it's what they can bear. As a result, they tend to have this thin veneer of civility that masks something much, much darker.
So it's like a variation on a theme. I like the idea of the Sanguine not touching. It highlights the distance between the vampire and the human.
There is something about the nature of the vampire that's sociopathic. We're so inundated, though, with images of the vampire that you can't depend on them killing or drinking blood to project the idea. touch, though, is important. We hug each other when we're happy or when we're offering sympathy. And think about meeting someone new for the first time. You offer your hand to shake. Now, if they don't take it, it's very off-putting because instinctively we know that they don't trust us, and in response we don't trust them. We have an empathic disconnect, which is a form of sociopathy.
Alright. Last month you were featured in a segment of Life Elsewhere here in Tampa Bay. Norman B. asked you whether or not you've mapped out Eduli Springs, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Because I know that you haven't, made a street level map yet, but you do have a lot of it in your head, not just locations, but history. Would you like to talk a little bit about this town you've created?
Well, Dooley Springs is a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. I considered how I wanted to manage the setting for a while. Originally, it was just going to be Sandy Springs, which is a real suburb. But I encountered a couple of problems. First, Atlanta and its suburbs are always changing. I have a 6-novel series that's going to be taking place in the area, and each book is going to be released once a year. In 6 years, Sandy Springs could be really different, and I didn't want to alienate my readers from reality that way. It's bad enough that I have to deal with actual geography of Atlanta. I try to limit the real locations so that, to ones that don't change that much.
The real locations?
I made up a few of my Atlanta locations too. For that, I play around with something else that's always aggravated me about living in Atlanta, in part because of the piecemeal way the city's put together. Atlanta has some grids to it, but if you look at the city as a whole, it's really just a patchwork, where smaller areas grew together in ways that they didn't really intend to. It looks more like a spiderweb than a city grid. The real-life result is that you find this place tucked away from everywhere else, and you fall in love with it. And you forget about it every once in a while because Atlanta's big and busy. And then you think about it, and you tell someone. You decide you're going to find it, and you can't. It's still there, you just can't find it. You try to go by landmarks, which have probably changed. And because of the way the major streets kind of weave through the city, sometimes those classical directions that you would use don't really make sense anymore. Other times, you may be giving someone directions, say from Midtown Atlanta to Little Five Points, and you're thinking of the different roads and landmarks. And then the next thing you know, your friend's in Virginia Highlands on the way to Decatur, and they're thinking you're an idiot. It's because of that webby way Atlanta's made up. In Book of Susan, I play with that concept. The real reason directions can be so strange to recall or relay, or we find places and lose them, is because Atlanta's full of all these between places, between all these sections of the city. Sometimes those places can be really awesome, but most often they're dangerous. And Devon finds that out very quickly. But for some people, some creatures, these between places are vital. They're the only places safe for them.
Okay. Going back to the town of Eduli Springs, one of the things about Georgia, or really any place in the South, is that names tend to mean something. The name might have to do with a descriptive feature, or maybe a battle, or even a famous person. What about Eduli Springs? What's important about its name?
Well, Eduli Springs is the town's past, present, and future. When I was choosing a name for my little suburb, I wanted something that would be very Georgia. One thing, if you have lived or spent any significant time in Atlanta, it has a lot of peach trees and a lot of springs. We have Peachtree Road, Peachtree Street, Peachtree Boulevard. We even have a Peachtree City. We have Powder Springs, Sandy Springs, Warm Springs. I thought that some kind of spring would be a good name, especially since I wanted along the Chattahoochee. And given how many springs there are just in Metro Atlanta, I didn't figure one more would be that big of a deal. The other thing is, pretty much, Georgia is kudzu. I have noticed over the year with the urban sprawl, a lot of the kudzu vines have been taken out. But when I was a kid, you couldn't look at the side of the highway without seeing it growing. And it still dominates some areas. Eduli Springs takes pride in it, cultivating the vine in Eduli Square. What we know of as kudzu has lots of species, one of them being Praria edulis, which I'm probably mispronouncing because I don't know Latin very well, which is known for, as the name would indicate, being edible.
So your town is Edible Springs.
Yeah. Delia talks about it in the book, when she gets to tell her own story about coming to the town. She took out a coven of Sanguines, who were terrorizing not just Eduli Springs, but other parts of the northern suburbs. Now it's her feeding ground, and she may not be the only thing feeding. I hint in Book of Dahlia and Book of Susan that there is something unusual about the kudzu. Kudzu's not an evergreen plant, but the kudzu in Eduli Square never browns. Something's up, and I wouldn't be surprised if that something is tied to Devon and the Shulim Cycle.
Okay, well, let's bring it back to where we are now. Right now, we're on a Kickstarter to do what exactly?
To raise money. With Book of Dahlia, I handled all of my own editing with your help and with some input here and there from friends who caught things. But for the most part, the editing was just you and I, and it was tough. This time, I want to hire a professional editor for the final draft of the book. I really wanted to give it a nice polish. And we'll also pay for another cover by Catherine Naudet, who I know is going to do another incredible job. She's very talented. That's the basic goal. I have tiered the goals, and what I do with it depends on where I get to. If I reach my second tier, then I can add promotional materials to the things purchased with the donations. That way I can get flyers and things like that to different conventions or bookstores. At the third tier, I want to add actual advertising campaigns on social networks and other avenues, whatever I can afford to do with it. I have a fourth tier too, and more details are on the Kickstarter page for that.
Why is this important? Other than money, of course, why is it that you're returning to Kickstarter? And why does it matter to you?
Well, for independent authors, our social networking is vital. That includes not just Facebook and Twitter and our blogs and blog networks, but projects like this too. You see, our networks are our publishers and our promoters. They're the people who either put their money or their energy and voice behind our work. So I'm going to ask you, please help me publish my work. Help me make Book of Susan a success.
Thank you, Lynn, for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you, Nick, for having me.
And that's it for our special Bayside Stories. I want to thank everyone for listening and supporting the project of one of our own. You can support in a lot of different ways. The most common is going to be by donating. And I know that not everyone can donate at a tier. Maybe you can't spend $10 to get an e-copy of the book. But maybe you can donate $1. The very basic goal is $1. If 1,000 people donate $1, then we've made our basic goal. In Atlanta, that's one apartment complex. If everyone there donated $1, we've got the goal. We have readers in Germany, in the UK, in Australia, Canada, America. No, not everyone is going to be able to do $300. But in the self-published community, we can start doing things like $1. Now, if you're not listening to this through the Kickstarter page, you can click the link here. And just tell others about it. Even if that $1 is too much and you can't help directly with that, you can help by sharing and just by letting other people know. And as always, good reading, everybody.